Sinestra is the fifth and final encounter in the Bastion of Twilight, and is only available on Heroic. You'll want 2 tanks, 5 to 7 healers, and the rest DPS. In Phase 1, Sinestra is weakened from past battles and nurturing the Twilight Brood. This means she only possesses 60% of her maximum health, and her damage dealt is reduced by 40%. Like Magma, Sinestra cannot move, and therefore becomes quite upset if her primary target is outside of melee range, triggering Twilight Blast. This deals way more damage than her regular melee attacks, so the active tank must stay within melee range of Sinestra during phases 1 and 3. 15 seconds into phase 1, Sinestra debuffs a random player with Rack. This dot deals increasing shadow damage every second for 1 minute, and will eventually kill its target if not dispelled. But dispelling it causes it to multiply, jumping to 2 nearby players. To that end, be mindful not to haphazardly dispel it, as doing so will cause it to quickly multiply and overwhelm your raid. For specific breakpoints, with 1 person dispelling every rack, this is what worked for us. Dispel the first rack after 18 to 19 seconds. Consider using an external to extend the duration. Dispel the second 2 racks after 16 to 18 seconds. Then begin dispelling the third rack off of 4 players at this point at 14 to 18 seconds. Note it takes 4 globals to get through every dispel, so if you start late, stacks may become unmanageable by the time you reach the 4th player. This should leave roughly 12 seconds left in the debuff for the now 8 afflicted players, at which point it should expire naturally. The next ability is Twilight Slicer. Every 30 seconds, Sinestra summons 2 shadowy orbs that fixate on 2 random players and pursue them for 15 seconds. Upon spawning, a beam connects the pursued player to the orb, and a couple seconds later, a much larger beam connects the 2 orbs. Standing near the large beam or sphere will likely mean death, so targeted players must maneuver in such a way that they avoid slicing other raiders. In most cases, this means running towards the back of the room. Exactly how players move will depend on the spawn location of the orb, but here are some tips. Connected players should keep their orbs close together, therefore shortening the length of the beam and lessening the likelihood you slice one of your friends. If not being pursued by an orb, but you're near a player that is, usually running towards the boss and away from the middle will move you to safety. And lastly, all players should stand no closer than maximum melee range from the boss. The orbs tend to spawn in a small radius around you, meaning if you're right up next to the boss, there's a chance the orb spawns in front of you even further inwards. This makes it much more difficult for the people around you to dodge the slicer. Moving on, roughly every 25 seconds, Sinestra will use Flame Breath, dealing large, raid-wide fire damage. It's very important to have raid defensive and healing cooldowns lined up for every breath. Most raids can expect 2 to 3 breaths in phase 1. Finally, Sinestra will periodically summon 5 Twilight Whelps to aid her in combat. These whelps do one of 2 things, the first being Twilight Spit. This deals low shadow damage to its target, but applies a stacking shadow damage taken debuff, up to a maximum of 99 stacks. The second thing is when killed for the first time, the Twilight Whelp spawns a Twilight Essence. This pool will slowly grow in size, dealing shadow damage to any players within it, and reanimating any whelps it comes in contact with. Regarding positioning, have the main tank with ranged DPS to one side of the boss and melee DPS on the other. Healers will split themselves into 2 groups. When Twilight Cutter goes out, pursued players should run towards the back of the room. The off-tank will be responsible for picking up whelps. Assign 1 healer to babysit them. When the first set of whelps spawn in, the off-tank will pick them up and tank them off to the side to avoid Twilight Slicer. We don't want to kill them just yet. A short while later, the second set of whelps will spawn in and the off-tank will once again pick them up. At this point, Sinestra should be near phasing, if not already, and the off-tank will drag the whelps to the back of the room with their assigned healer in hot pursuit. At 30% health, Sinestra enters her second phase, restoring health and erecting a mana shield to protect herself while she casts Twilight Extinction. During this time, The Red Dragon Kalistraz, or Kalen in his human form, joins the fray to aid your party, erecting a shield that mitigates 99% of the damage Twilight Extinction deals. While this is going on, DPS can finally AoE down the whelps, killing them all in the corner of the room and stacking the pools of Twilight Essence on top of each other. This causes the whelps to respawn, and DPS will AoE them down once more. They will not drop pools the second time they die. Once the Twilight Extinction cast has completed, Kalen and Sinestra will engage in a magical duel. The duelist with the most mana gains the upper hand, with the progress of this duel shown by the channeled beams. Kalen will siphon his life to regain mana, so healers must be sure to keep Kalen alive. Sinestra's barrier will restore any lost health at the expense of her mana. If left untouched, Sinestra's beam will close in on and eventually kill Kalen. This will wipe the raid. To prevent this from happening, we'll need to assign DPS to whittle her mana down. Once Sinestra's mana has been brought to 40%, she has no choice but to lift the Twilight Carapace, protecting her eggs, absorbing their energy to restore her mana. In other words, the previously impervious eggs become vulnerable. Once DPS finish off the 2 eggs, Phase 3 begins. Depending on your raid's DPS, some groups may plan to phase the boss during this first vulnerability window, splitting DPS on each egg. However, during progression, it's probably safest to plan around 2 vulnerability windows. For this strategy, have about half your DPS, preferably ranged, assigned to hitting Sinestra and the eggs. These DPS will position to one side, bring Sinestra to 40% mana, kill 1 egg, and then repeat on the opposite side. Meanwhile, 2 different types of adds will spawn throughout the phase. These adds will be the responsibility of your remaining DPS, mostly melee, and tanks. The first type of add being Twilight Drakes, which have a frontal, so face them away. And if at any point they touch a pool of Twilight Essence, they'll begin absorbing its energy, increasing health and damage by 10% per stack. The second type of adds are Twilight Spikecallers. These mobs will cast Unleash Essence, a raid-wide dot that drains 10% health per second from all players and Kalen. This ability is very dangerous and must be stopped, but if at any point a Spikecaller is stunned or interrupted, it gains Indomitable. This knocks any players within 8 yards back, dealing moderate damage and making it immune to all forms of crowd control. Hence, conventional stops will not work. Instead, knockbacks, disorients, incapacitates, and sleeps must be used instead. Note that if at any point a Spikecaller is accidentally interrupted or stunned, Indomitable is considered an enrage and can be removed with soothe effects. For DPS assigned to these adds, the priority here is always Spikecallers first, Drake second. DPS need to keep up with the rate at which Spikecallers spawn. Any more than 1 active Spikecaller makes things much more dangerous. Once Sinestra phases, finish off all remaining adds, and be careful of any newly spawning Spikecallers. They have like a 20-second RP window where they're running down the ramp into the arena. If the boss phases during this time, your raid will still need to deal with that Spikecaller. As a healer during this phase, position centrally such that you can reach all players and Kalen, and use your mana aggressively. You'll get it back in Phase 3. Finally, concerning tanks, as discussed going into Phase 2, the off-tank will have just finished dealing with their 2 waves of whelps from Phase 1. Now, depending on how quickly the boss was pushed into Phase 2, a 3rd wave of whelps may or may not spawn. If it does, the off-tank will pick them up and repeat the same process as done with the previous set of whelps, placing the new pools adjacent to the old ones while DPS finish them off. If the 3rd whelp set doesn't spawn, however, DPS will go and hit Sinestra for another 20 seconds or so until the first Spikecaller and Drake spawn in. Have the off-tank grab Spikecallers while the main tank holds the Twilight Drakes. Try to stack these adds together for cleave, but as the off-tank, be mindful not to stand in front of the Drake. With high stacks of Twilight Spit, the frontal will likely kill you. Once both eggs have been destroyed, Sinestra brings her duel with Kalen to an end and attacks players with her full fury. DPS players must focus down any remaining Twilight Drakes and Spikecallers from Phase 2 before working on Sinestra. Phase 3 is mechanically the same as it was in Phase 1, but this time Sinestra starts the phase with a full health bar and she no longer deals reduced damage. To help the raid, Kaelin grants Essence of the Red to all players, granting 100% increased melee, ranged, and spell haste, and causing players to regain 5% of their maximum mana per second. This buff lasts 3 minutes. Your DPS should work through most of Sinestra's health bar during this time. Continue to rotate through raid cooldowns during Flame Breath, and healers spam their biggest and most expensive heals. You will not go while buffed with Essence of the Red. The off-tank will repeat the same sequence from Phase 1, picking up and tanking the first 2 sets of whelps off to the side. Once the second wave of whelps has fully spawned in, the off-tank and several DPS, preferably ranged, will drag the whelps to the back of the room and AoE them down, spawning pools of Twilight Essence. The off-tank will then make their way over to Sinestra, such that when the adds respawn, melee can help cleave and AoE them down. Remember, they will not drop pools the second time they die. Once the whelps have died for a second time, the off-tank taunts Sinestra, swapping roles with the main tank. Because Sinestra doesn't do any shadow damage herself, this gives the off-tank time for their Twilight Spit stacks to fall off. Meanwhile, the main tank will gather whelp sets 3 and 4, following the same sequence as previously done by the off-tank. Once Essence of the Red falls off, press Bloodlust and burn the boss down, before either your healers go or you run out of space. If you can manage that successfully, that's the fight. And the Bastion of Twilight complete. Thanks for watching. I hope you found these guides helpful in one way or another. If you did, drop a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'll see you in the next one.